In the waning years of the 1930s, the world teetered on the edge of a second Great War. The scars of World War I still marred the landscape and the psyche of Europe. But something far more terrifying now stirred beneath the surface, something that fused ideology with science, ambition with terror. Adolf Hitler, having already annexed Austria and seized the Sudetenland, seemed unstoppable. His vision of a racially pure Reich demanded expansion, and his war machine grew louder with every passing month. For ordinary people, daily life was punctuated with rumors of new weapons, secret technologies, and whispers of unimaginable destruction. In this storm of political upheaval and military aggression, an even quieter revolution was occurring in the world of physics. Theories once considered abstract and irrelevant to daily life had begun to reshape the very foundations of reality. Scientists were no longer merely curious observers of nature's laws. They were, increasingly, becoming wielders of power, and some of them began to realize that the forces they had unlocked could be used not only to understand the universe but to destroy it. Albert Einstein, already a household name thanks to his theory of relativity, watched these events with a growing sense of dread. Though far removed from Germany, now living in exile in the United States, his heart remained tangled in the fate of Europe. Einstein had fled the Nazi regime in 1933, disillusioned and heartbroken by the rise of fascism in the country that had nurtured his genius. In America, he took refuge in both academic life and his deep commitment to pacifism. But as storm clouds gathered over the continent he had left behind, even Einstein began to wonder if peace could survive the tools his own science had helped create. Elsewhere, far from political podiums and military drills, in the quiet sanctuaries of laboratories, a different kind of drama unfolded. In late 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann made a discovery that would change everything. They had split the uranium atom. This phenomenon, later explained by Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch, was nuclear fission, and it released a staggering amount of energy. The implications were immediately apparent to physicists. If controlled, fission could be a powerful source of energy. If weaponized, it could lead to bombs of unprecedented destruction. News of this discovery traveled quickly across the scientific community. Physicists in Europe and America began to calculate the theoretical possibilities, some with curiosity, others with alarm. A few realized that uranium, if concentrated in sufficient quantities, could indeed serve as the core of a superweapon. Among them was a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard, who had long feared that scientific advancement might one day yield the ultimate weapon. When he read of the German breakthrough, Szilard's fears intensified. If Nazi Germany harnessed this new power first, the consequences for the world could be apocalyptic. Szilard understood that time was critical. He began to contemplate how to bring this warning to the attention of those with the power to act. But in the United States of 1939, the government was deeply isolationist. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a nation weary of war, hesitant to intervene in European affairs. Scientific warnings, even dire ones, often failed to penetrate the walls of policy and politics. Szilard needed a voice that could not be ignored, someone whose name alone carried the weight of authority and brilliance. And so, his thoughts turned to Albert Einstein. Though Einstein had removed himself from political engagement in many ways, Szilard believed that only Einstein could provide the gravitas necessary to wake Roosevelt from his slumber. But would Einstein, a man who had sworn himself to peace, be willing to advocate for the creation of a weapon beyond imagination? Would he lend his name to a cause that could lead the world to the very destruction he had always feared? These questions would soon take Szilard to a quiet cottage on Long Island. There, amid the tranquil whisper of ocean breezes and the scent of salt and pine, Einstein rested unaware that within days he would sign a letter that would tilt the course of history. A letter fewer than 200 words long, but heavy with the weight of the world. Albert Einstein was no stranger to war, though he had never served as a soldier nor fired a weapon in battle. Born in Germany in 1879, Einstein had been a witness to the madness of the First World War and the fervent nationalism that had swallowed much of Europe. He detested the blind loyalty demanded by governments, the violent pageantry of militarism, and the suffering it wrought upon the world. As a young man, Einstein had declared himself a pacifist and idealist who believed that reason, dialogue, and understanding were mankind's only hope for a peaceful future. War, he believed, was a failure of civilization. By the 1920s, Einstein's voice had risen above the laboratory walls. He was not only the world's most famous physicist, but also one of its most vocal moral thinkers. He wrote essays condemning conscription, publicly criticized the arms race, and supported conscientious objectors. He saw nationalism as a disease and argued for a global, unified government that transcended borders. For Einstein, the pursuit of knowledge was sacred, and science was meant to elevate the human spirit, not to be shackled to the engines of war. But as the 1930s wore on, the world seemed less interested in peace and more enthralled by power. In Germany, the country of his birth, Adolf Hitler had come to power. With him came a toxic blend of racism, authoritarianism, and mythic nationalism. As Jewish scientists were purged from universities, as books were burned and freedoms strangled, Einstein's pacifism was put to the test. In 1933, realizing he could no longer safely return home, Einstein emigrated to the United States and took a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Even in exile, Einstein did not remain silent. He denounced the Nazi regime with passion, raising funds for Jewish refugees and speaking out against fascism. But he also understood that pacifism in its purest form might no longer be enough. The world was changing too quickly, too violently, and science, his beloved rational discipline, was increasingly being weaponized. The irony was not lost on him. Equations that had once been scribbled on blackboards by candlelight. Still, Einstein held firm to his ideals. In 1935, he publicly defended Bertrand Russell, another pacifist thinker, and wrote that war cannot be humanized. It can only be abolished. He refused to participate in military research and declined offers to assist in weapons development. Even as war clouds gathered over Europe, Einstein believed that the United States should stay neutral, that peace must be preserved at all costs. His optimism, however, was becoming increasingly strained. Privately, Einstein worried. Reports from Europe were grim. Hitler had reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and turned his gaze toward Czechoslovakia. The Nazi regime's obsession with racial purity and expansionism was no longer theoretical lit, was marching across borders. And among the scientific community, there was another, more chilling concern. If Nazi Germany harnessed the power of nuclear fission, they could create a bomb unlike anything the world had ever seen. To many of his colleagues, the threat was obvious and urgent. But Einstein hesitated. He did not want to use his influence to drive the world closer to war. He distrusted government secrecy and feared that scientific advancement might become enslaved to political ambitions. Still, the whispers of fission, uranium, and chain reactions grew louder. Friends and fellow physicists approached him with grave expressions and frantic calculations. Einstein, they said, needed to act. Leo Szilard, perhaps more than any other, understood what was at stake. He had seen the consequences of political indifference. He had watched Hitler rise while the world looked away, and now he saw the possibility of apocalypse if the Nazis were first to build an atomic bomb. Einstein respected Szilard's intellect and moral clarity. When Szilard came to him with an urgent plan to draft a letter warning the U.S. president about this new and terrible possibility, Einstein listened. The decision did not come easily. It required Einstein to set aside, if only briefly, a lifetime of pacifist conviction. It required him to accept that war, in some cases, might be the lesser evil. And it required him to lend his name, the name of the man who unraveled the secrets of space and time, to a message that could set in motion the greatest arms race in human history. But in the quiet of his Long Island retreat, Einstein made his choice. He would sign the letter. He would warn Roosevelt, not because he believed in war, but because he feared what would happen if he did nothing. The world was changing, and so, reluctantly, Albert Einstein prepared to change with it. In the waning months of 1938, as the world watched Europe lurched toward war, a different kind of revolution quietly occurred in a Berlin laboratory. Chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had been experimenting with uranium, attempting to understand its behavior when bombarded with neutrons. What they observed was unexpected uranium atoms were breaking apart, producing much lighter elements like barium. It made little sense according to existing models. They published their results without fully grasping the significance. It would take Lise Meitner, an Austrian physicist in exile, to understand what had happened. The uranium nucleus had undergone fission. Nuclear fission, Meitner and her nephew, Otto Frisch, explained, was the process by which a heavy atomic nucleus splits into smaller fragments, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. It was not just another laboratory curiosity, it was a discovery that cracked open the atom itself. The amount of energy released by a single fission reaction was minuscule, but the potential for a chain reaction, one atom splitting and triggering the split of others, suggested a scale of power never before imagined. When this news reached scientists in the United States and Britain, the reaction was immediate. In theory, if one could create a self-sustaining chain reaction within a mass of uranium-235 or plutonium-239, the result would be an explosion of devastating force. It was no longer science fiction. The prospect of an atomic bomb moved from fantasy to feasibility almost overnight. The discovery set off quiet panic in the global physics community. Among those most alarmed was Leo Szilard, the Hungarian physicist who had once dreamed up the idea of a nuclear chain reaction while crossing a London street in 1933. Szilard had long feared the consequences of unchecked scientific discovery, especially in the hands of aggressive nations. He had already filed patents for a nuclear reactor and was actively thinking about the ethical implications of atomic power. The confirmation of fission in uranium gave his fears teeth. Szilard began reaching out to fellow physicists Sedward Teller, Enrico Fermi, and eventually Einstein, sharing both the scientific reality and the geopolitical danger. He worried, correctly, that Germany would pursue this technology with ruthless efficiency. Uranium was not rare, and Germany had access to mines in Czechoslovakia. Worse, several top German scientists, Heisenberg among them, were perfectly capable of designing a bomb. The risk was no longer theoretical. The problem, however, was communication. Scientists understood the danger, but policymakers did not. The American government was not known for its swiftness when it came to theoretical science. President Roosevelt's advisors were busy with Depression-era recovery efforts and cautious about any action that could draw the U.S. into another European war. Szilard knew he needed a powerful voice, someone the president would not ignore. That voice, inevitably, was Einstein's. Though Einstein was not directly involved in nuclear research at the time, he had not worked on fission and was more focused on unified field theory. His name still carried monumental weight. Einstein was not just a scientist, he was a symbol of scientific truth, a cultural icon whose authority reached beyond academia. If Einstein warned the president, perhaps the message would be heard. But Einstein had to understand the science first. Szilard arranged to meet him, explain the findings, and present the implications. He needed Einstein to grasp just how real this was, that the Nazis might already be working toward a bomb, and that the United States had to act first. It was a meeting that would shape the century. Understanding nuclear fission was, at its core, understanding the power hidden in matter itself. Einstein's own equation E equals mc had predicted this possibility decades earlier. That mass could be converted into energy was not merely an elegant truth, it was now a deadly one. A single kilogram of uranium-235, properly arranged, could release energy equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. It was the weaponization of physics, the conversion of equations into extinction. Einstein had always viewed his theory as an insight into the universe's beauty, not a blueprint for destruction. Yet here was Szilard, presenting a direct line from scientific discovery to potential apocalypse. The Nazis, Szilard warned, would not hesitate to use such a weapon. They would use it to conquer the world. The only chance to prevent that outcome was to beat them to it. For Einstein, the dilemma was profound. The theoretical framework he had built was now at the heart of the world's most dangerous technology. To remain silent was to risk Nazi domination. To speak up was to ignite an arms race. Either choice was heavy with consequences. Still, the science was clear. The chain reaction was possible. The bomb could be built. And Einstein, reluctantly, began to realize that the time had come to sound the alarm. In the quiet of his study, as waves lapped at the shore outside his Long Island retreat, Einstein considered the impossible, that he, a pacifist who hated war, would soon help launch the deadliest weapons program in history, all because science had gone one step further and history demanded a response. As the sun set on the 1930s, Europe found itself descending rapidly into chaos. Hitler had invaded Poland in September 1939, prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany. The world was officially at war again, but behind the clash of armies and the roar of bombers, another quieter, deadlier race had already begun, one measured not in miles or battles, but in isotopes and scientific equations. It was the race for the atomic bomb, and it had begun in earnest. For the physicists watching from laboratories across the Atlantic, the German invasion of Poland was not just the start of another war, it was a terrifying acceleration. Many of them were recent refugees from fascism themselves, Jews, intellectuals, pacifists who had fled Hitler's growing shadow. These scientists knew firsthand the brutality of the Nazi regime. They also knew what it meant for that regime to possibly possess a weapon of such unimaginable scale. Germany, by 1939, had assembled an impressive cadre of nuclear physicists. Werner Heisenberg, one of the most brilliant minds in quantum mechanics, was reportedly leading nuclear research efforts under the Third Reich. The Nazis had access to uranium ore from mines in the recently annexed region of Czechoslovakia, giving them the raw materials needed for fission. While it was unclear just how close they were to a bomb, the possibility alone was enough to send ripples of panic through the Allied scientific community. In contrast, the United States remained largely unprepared. The government had no formal atomic research program. There was no funding, no infrastructure, and crucially no sense of urgency among policymakers. President Roosevelt, while aware of tensions in Europe, remained cautious. The U.S. had only just begun to crawl out of the Great Depression, and the American public was in no mood for another European war. For many in Washington, the idea of a nuclear bomb sounded like science fiction. But for physicists like Leo Szilard and Enrico Fermi, it was science facthand. It was imminent. They feared that without immediate action, Hitler might win the race. Szilard, in particular, was haunted by the thought of Nazi Germany wielding the power of fission. He had spent years warning his peers about the destructive potential of atomic energy. Now, with the world at war, those warnings took on a new and terrifying weight. There were few avenues to push the American government into action. Scientists were respected, but their voices often drowned in the noise of politics. What they needed was a figure so prominent, so universally admired, that even the president would listen. Once again, all eyes turned to Einstein. Einstein had the celebrity, the intellect, and the moral gravitas to move mountains. More than a mere physicist, he had become a symbol of truth and reason. Though he was not directly involved in nuclear research, his name was synonymous with atomic theory, thanks in large part to his famous equation. If Einstein spoke, the world would listen. Szilard knew that Einstein's signature on a letter could be the catalyst they needed, but time was short. With German scientists potentially working on a bomb, the United States had to begin immediately organizing a committee, securing uranium supplies, funding research. It all hinged on a single message reaching the president in time. But even as the scientists scrambled to draft the letter, they faced internal conflicts. What exactly should they say? How much should they reveal? Should they urge Roosevelt to build a bomb, or merely investigate the possibility? Would they sound alarmist or credible? The responsibility weighed heavily on them. They were walking a tightrope between warning and provoking, between urgency and fear. Their goal was simple: make Roosevelt understand that science had crossed a threshold, that the potential for mass destruction was no longer abstract, that the Nazis might already be well ahead, and that if the United States failed to act, the consequences could be catastrophic. This was not a theoretical war of ideas. It was a real war, and the battleground now included neutron velocities and isotope separation. In this strange new arena, the stakes were nothing less than the future of civilization. The scientists knew that whoever won the atomic race would hold the power to end the war, end the world. In the end, they decided that only one voice could carry their warning with the clarity and force needed. That voice belonged to Albert Einstein. It was now up to him to warn the president. not with calculations or scientific jargon, but with a few carefully chosen words, a letter, a signal fire, a plea for action before it was too late. The story of the letter to Roosevelt cannot be told without placing Leo Szilard at its center. A Hungarian émigré, Szilard was not as famous as Einstein, nor as widely celebrated as Enrico Fermi, but he was, in many ways, the conscience of the atomic age. Where others pursued knowledge for its own sake, Szilard had always been haunted by the implications. He was among the first to grasp not just the possibility of atomic power, but the urgency of its control. Szilard had fled Europe years earlier, driven not only by fear of fascism, but also by a prophetic sense that science was approaching a precipice. He had, back in 1933, conceived the idea of a nuclear chain reaction years before the term became common knowledge. As Hitler rose to power, Szilard had already begun to imagine the weapon such a reaction might create. He once remarked that the discovery of nuclear fission would change everything except how men think. When Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann announced their successful fission of the uranium nucleus in 1938, Szilard's alarm bells rang loud and clear. He immediately understood that the age of atomic weapons had begun, even if the world had not yet noticed. He feared that German scientists, unshackled by moral restraint and backed by the Nazi war machine, could turn this new knowledge into a decisive military advantage. Szilard wasn't content to wait and see. He wanted to act. But Szilard, despite his brilliance, lacked access to the corridors of power. He was a physicist, not a politician. What he needed was a voice that would carry, so he turned to someone who had both. Albert Einstein. Szilard and Einstein had known each other for years. They had collaborated on refrigerator designs in the 1920s, long before either had imagined their work might intersect with the fate of civilization. Einstein admired Szilard's mind and his tenacity. The two men were very different. Einstein, the philosophical idealist, Szilard, the pragmatic alarm sounder. Yet they shared a belief in reason and in humanity's obligation to act when knowledge demanded it. In July of 1939, Szilard contacted Einstein through a mutual acquaintance and arranged a meeting. Einstein was vacationing at his cottage in Pequannock on Long Island, a modest retreat where he enjoyed sailing and quiet study. Szilard, accompanied by fellow physicist Edward Teller, made the trip out. The meeting would become a moment of understated but seismic historical consequence. There, surrounded by the sea breeze and the creak of wooden floors, Szilard explained the breakthrough in fission and the grave danger it posed. Einstein listened carefully. He was not up to date on the latest developments in nuclear physics, but quickly grasped the implications. When Szilard described the possibility of a bomb that could destroy an entire city, Einstein was visibly shaken. It was a moment of profound internal conflict. Einstein, who had sworn never to assist in military research, now faced a terrible choice. His scientific insight, particularly the implications of EMC, had helped lay the foundation for nuclear physics, and now that insight might be used to develop the most destructive weapon the world had ever known. But Einstein also recognized that inaction might be more dangerous. If Nazi Germany developed the bomb first, it could impose a nightmare order upon the world. So Einstein agreed. He would sign a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Szilard would write it, and Einstein would lend his name and authority to its message. It would be a brief letter, but its purpose would be enormous: to alert the U.S. government to the potential of nuclear weapons, and to spur immediate action. Over the next few weeks, Szilard drafted the letter. He consulted with fellow physicists, choosing his words carefully. The goal was not to incite panic, but to convey urgency. He described the recent advances in nuclear chain reactions, the potential for constructing extremely powerful bombs, and the possibility that Germany was already working on such weapons. He suggested that the United States begin stockpiling uranium and support experimental research. The final letter was fewer than 600 words in total, but its Hardenstein's signature and the concise warning it carried was distilled into a critical paragraph. It would not provide a blueprint for a bomb. It would not use technical jargon. It was simply a scientist telling a president that a new kind of weapon was possible, and that the enemy might get there first. Einstein signed it, not lightly and not without misgiving. He knew what it might lead to, but in his mind it was the only choice that remained. Humanity had split the atom. Now it had to reckon with what lay inside. The story of Einstein's pivotal letter to Roosevelt takes on an almost surreal quality when one considers where it began, in a quiet, salt-kissed cottage by the sea. During the summer of 1939, Albert Einstein had retreated to a rented house in Pequannock, a small hamlet on Long Island's North Fork. The home was unremarkable, perched modestly on the shore, its porch creaking under the weight of time and ocean breeze. It was here, amid the scent of salt water and the quiet shuffle of sand, that history was nudged toward a new trajectory. Einstein was in his element at the beach. Removed from the noise of Princeton and the turbulence of Europe, he enjoyed the solitude. He spent his days reading, writing, sailing his small boat, and entertaining the occasional visitor. He had grown weary of public life and politics. At Pequannock, he could indulge in the abstract pondering unified field theory, musing over letters, and gazing at the stars. His white hair, wild in the wind, had become a symbol of eccentric genius. But beneath the calm exterior, the world he had known was unraveling. When Leo Szilard and Edward Teller arrived at the cottage on July 30th, 1939, it was not Einstein the philosopher they sought, but Einstein the symbol. Szilard had traveled with a sense of mission. He carried no bomb plans, no uranium samples, just words urgently composed, thick with scientific implication and moral weight. Szilard knew that Einstein's signature would be more potent than any calculation or formula he could present. The two men sat in wooden chairs on the porch, waves lapping gently in the distance. Einstein listened intently as Szilard laid out the discovery of nuclear fission and the potential for a chain reaction that could be weaponized. Teller added technical context, painting a picture of how even a relatively small amount of uranium-235 could release a terrifying explosion. Einstein's face grew grave. He had not been closely following the developments in fission. His interests had drifted from the nuclear to the cosmological, but he understood the physics immediately. It was, after all, his own equation E equals mc that explained the vast energy hidden within matter. Mass into energy, energy into destruction. As Szilard spoke, Einstein saw clearly what was now possible: a weapon that could flatten a city, end a war, or begin the end of civilization. The conversation shifted from science to geopolitics. Szilard explained that German physicists were likely aware of the same possibilities, and that the Reich had access to uranium from Czechoslovakia. If they moved first, the consequences could be unimaginable. Einstein's homeland, now under Hitler's rule, had already demonstrated its ruthlessness. Giving such a regime the power of atomic fire was an idea too terrifying to ignore. Einstein was deeply disturbed. As a Jew, he had lost his country, his citizenship, his colleagues. He had watched the flames of fascism consume Europe. Now, it seemed, science itself was at risk of becoming a weapon of tyranny. It was no longer enough to observe from afar. He had to speak clearly, urgently, and with purpose. Szilard produced a draft of the letter, scribbled on hotel stationery. It was concise, respectful, and direct. It warned that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future, and that this new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs. The letter urged the U.S. government to take action, to fund research, to secure uranium supplies, to prepare. Einstein read the letter in silence. Then, with a heavy breath, he agreed to sign it. He was not enthusiastic. He did not relish the role of war advisor, but he understood that his name carried weight, and that in moments of crisis, silence could be deadly. His signature was not a surrender of principle, it was a grim acknowledgement of necessity. The letter, once signed, needed to reach the right hands. Szilard knew that mailing it wouldn't be enough. It had to be delivered personally, explained, contextualized, and so he turned to Alexander Sachs, a well-connected economist and presidential advisor. Sachs would carry the letter to Washington, an attempt to gain an audience with Roosevelt himself. As Szilard and Teller left Pekinik, Einstein remained on his porch, staring out at the sea. The wind tugged at his shirt. The world, it seemed, was drifting toward something terrible, and he had just nudged it further along that path. Behind him, on the small desk inside the cottage, lay the draft of the letter that would soon change the course of history. Just a few paragraphs on paper, but between its lines lay the weight of a century. The letter Albert Einstein signed that warm day in July 1939 was neither poetic nor fiery. It was restrained, formal, and diplomatic, yet its implications were earth-shaking. Drafted primarily by Leo Szilard, with input from Edward Teller and physicist Eugene Wigner, the document represented an extraordinary convergence of intellect and urgency. In it, a handful of refugee scientists from Europe sought to awaken the most powerful man in the world to a danger that had not yet dawned on his government: the threat of nuclear warfare. The final version of the letter was composed in careful, unassuming prose. It began by informing President Franklin D. Roosevelt of recent developments in nuclear physics, specifically the ability to induce nuclear chain reactions in uranium, which could produce massive amounts of energy. The letter explained that such reactions could lead to the creation of extremely powerful bombs of a new type, far surpassing anything in existence. Einstein warned that a single bomb could potentially destroy an entire port and the surrounding area. These were not idle warnings. The letter included a sobering implication. Germany was actively working to secure uranium ore and had already restricted the export of uranium from occupied Czechoslovakia. This suggested that the Nazis were not only aware of the breakthrough, but possibly already attempting to weaponize it. The letter encouraged Roosevelt to act swiftly by funding further research, coordinating with physicists, and securing access to uranium resources. Einstein's role in the letter was more symbolic than technical. Though he had not contributed to the breakthrough discoveries in fission, his signature lent the document an undeniable weight. In 1939, few names commanded more respect than Einstein's. His scientific authority and moral credibility elevated the letter from a private warning to a matter of national concern. It was, in essence, a clarion call to the president's science, alerting politics to a new dimension of power. Once signed, the letter began its slow journey to the White House, rather than send it through the mail. Szilard and Wigner entrusted it to Alexander Sachs, a friend of Roosevelt's and an economist with connections in the administration. Sachs had previously advised the president on issues related to science and defense, and he seemed the ideal intermediary to deliver this message faced. But even with Sachs' involvement, the process was not immediate. Roosevelt's schedule was crowded, and the United States was not yet at war. It would take weeks before Sachs was able to secure a private audience with the president. During that time, Szilard and others drafted a second, more detailed memorandum to accompany the letter. This supplemental document laid out the logistics of atomic research and the urgency of action. Together, the letter and memo formed the foundation of what would become a national effort to explore atomic energy. Einstein's original draft of the letter, preserved today in archives, is startling in its calm tone. There is no hyperbole, no exclamation points, no dire predictions, just the plain, measured voice of science saying, in effect, this is real, and it's coming. The simplicity of the letter makes it all the more haunting. It was not a threat, it was a warning, and, perhaps most chillingly, a suggestion that the world's future would now hinge on who acted first. The original letter was dated August 2nd, 1939. Less than a month later, Germany invaded Poland. By September, World War II had begun. The world was still unaware of the atomic age inching toward it, but in the shadows, preparations had begun. And all of it, the urgency, the funding, the infrastructure, it started with those few paragraphs and Einstein's reluctant signature. Later in life, Einstein would reflect on this moment with deep ambivalence. He had acted out of fear that Hitler might develop the bomb first, but the consequences of his action would spiral far beyond what he imagined. At the time, however, the choice seemed clear. To do nothing was to risk catastrophe. And so, the letter was written, it was delivered. And soon, the machinery of war would shift into a new and terrible gear. No explosion marked this moment. No tanks moved. No sirens wailed. Just a letter, quietly signed and sent on its way, a letter that would ripple outward through laboratories and factories, across deserts and oceans, until it reached Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the history of the world was rewritten. By early October 1939, the letter bearing Albert Einstein's signature had not yet reached its intended recipient in any meaningful sense. Though physically in hand, it remained unread by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, buried under the weight of 1,000 other matters. War had erupted in Europe. The United States, still clinging to its neutrality, watched nervously as German forces stormed across Poland. The urgency behind the letter grew with each passing day. Alexander Sachs, the economist and informal advisor tasked with delivering the letter, understood the delicate dance of access. A respected figure in policy circles, Sachs had previously impressed Roosevelt with his analysis of economic and technological matters, but even he struggled to find the right moment to bring up something as speculative and potentially unsettling as atomic weaponry. The president was consumed with foreign policy, military readiness, and maintaining domestic stability in a deeply divided America. On October 11th, Sachs finally secured a private audience with Roosevelt. The meeting did not begin with science. Instead, Sachs opened with a long and winding anecdote about science and national defense, drawing on historical examples. He spoke of Napoleon's failure to embrace new technologies, of missed opportunities in past wars, of the importance of listening to the quiet warnings of scientists before events spiral out of control. It was a roundabout introduction, but Roosevelt listened. Eventually, Sachs produced the letter from Einstein and laid out its core message. He explained the discovery of nuclear fission, the possibility of a chain reaction, and the danger of Germany developing an atomic bomb. He presented the accompanying memorandum, detailing the steps the United States should consider: securing uranium supplies, investing in theoretical research, and forming a government committee to explore the issue. Roosevelt, intrigued but cautious, absorbed the information with a mix of curiosity and strategic calculation. Roosevelt's response was characteristically calm and deliberate. He didn't panic. He didn't leap into action. Instead, he turned to his military aide, General Edwin Pa Watson, and famously said, "Pa, this requires action." With that, the wheels began to turn. The president instructed his administration to investigate the matter further, to begin exploring the feasibility of nuclear research as a matter of national defense. This quiet moment in the Oval Office marked the first step toward what would become the most secretive and consequential scientific project in history, the Manhattan Project. It was not yet called that, and its scope was still unimaginable. But the fuse had been lit. From this point forward, atomic energy would no longer be confined to dusty academic journals. It would enter the bloodstream of national policy and global warfare. Roosevelt moved cautiously at first. He authorized the creation of an advisory committee on uranium, chaired by Lyman Briggs, director of the National Bureau of Standards. The committee's initial efforts were modest small grants, basic experiments, but they signaled the beginning of federal involvement. More importantly, they opened the door for future coordination between physicists and the government. For Szilard, Sachs, and their colleagues, the president's engagement was a victory, albeit a quiet one. Their fears had been heard. The letter had not been lost to bureaucracy. Einstein's voice, projected through the channels of diplomacy and science, had reached the highest office in the land. The next phase, scaling up research, testing theories, and eventually constructing a working weapon, would be the work of years. But it had all started here, with a letter, a conversation, and a simple acknowledgement from a president that the world was entering a new and perilous age. Einstein, for his part, returned to Princeton. He would not be involved in the subsequent developments. His role had been to warn, not to build. As scientists and engineers across the country began the painstaking process of transforming theory into weaponry, Einstein resumed his work in theoretical physics, troubled but resolved. He had done what he believed was necessary. Whether it was right, that only history could decide. The delivery of the letter, like the letter itself, was understated, almost mundane. No great speeches, no flashing headlines, just a quiet moment behind closed doors, where science met statecraft and set the course of the 20th century. In that room, the modern world was conceived not with a bang, but with a signature and a whisper. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt read Einstein's letter and Sachs' accompanying memorandum, he was not alarmed in the way one might expect. Roosevelt, a master politician and strategist, understood the importance of timing and discretion. He had faced monumental crises before: the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the looming threat of another world war. Now, presented with a letter suggesting that a single bomb could destroy a city, he responded not with panic, but with methodical planning. Roosevelt did not possess a technical background in science, but he was a shrewd reader of human urgency. He recognized that the letter wasn't just a speculative warning, it was a signal from the most respected scientific minds of the era, men who had fled tyranny and who spoke not from alarmism, but from knowledge. He was also keenly aware that Nazi Germany had already demonstrated a willingness to harness advanced technology for military use: rockets, jets, chemical warfare. The idea that they might pursue nuclear weapons seemed entirely plausible. After his meeting with Sachs, Roosevelt made a note: "This needs action." With those 3 words, the path toward government-sponsored nuclear research was cleared. On October 21, 1939, just 10 days after the letter was delivered, Roosevelt sent a reply to Einstein. In it, he thanked the physicist for bringing the matter to his attention and assured him that he had established a committee to investigate the issue. The letter, though polite and brief, confirmed that the machinery of the U.S. government was now slowly beginning to turn. Roosevelt appointed Lyman Briggs to chair the Advisory Committee on Uranium. Briggs was a competent scientist and bureaucrat, respected but cautious. Under his leadership, the committee began modestly reviewing theoretical work on uranium and chain reactions, allocating a small budget to support experiments. Their first official meeting, held in October 1939, was low-key. There were no sweeping mandates, no grand declarations, but it marked the formal beginning of what would become the Manhattan Project. The initial pace was frustratingly slow for Szilard and his colleagues. They knew how quickly Germany might move and worried that the U.S. government's response lacked urgency. Still, Roosevelt was navigating a complex political environment. The United States was not yet at war. The public was firmly isolationist, appropriating large sums of money for a weapon that didn't yet exist, based on a letter and some promising equations, would have been politically untenable. Over time, however, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. Roosevelt, ever pragmatic, expanded the Uranium Committee's mandate. In 1940, the National Defense Research Committee was formed under the leadership of Vannevar Bush, a visionary engineer who understood both the scientific and bureaucratic landscapes. Bush would later report directly to Roosevelt, allowing atomic research to bypass layers of red tape. As the war in Europe escalated and Hitler's forces swept across the continent, Roosevelt's interest in atomic research deepened. Intelligence reports began to suggest that Germany was indeed pursuing uranium enrichment and might already have a head start. The need to outpace the Nazis became more than theoretical, it became strategic. By 1941, with the entry of the United States into World War II looming, Roosevelt authorized more extensive funding and support for nuclear research. The effort was now rebranded and reorganized, moving from quiet advisory panels into secret laboratories and vast construction sites. The Manhattan Project, as it would eventually be known, was still in its infancy, but the scaffolding had been set. All of this billions of dollars in resources, thousands of scientists and engineers, entire cities built in secrecies, stemmed from Einstein's brief letter and Roosevelt's calm but decisive reaction. It is often said that Roosevelt's genius lay not in mastering the details, but in recognizing the right people to trust. In this case, he trusted Einstein's signature, Szilard's urgency, and Sachs' conviction. He did not dismiss the science, even though its implications were vast and unsettling. Instead, He folded it into his strategic vision of the war effort, a tool to be developed quietly, patiently, and with absolute secrecy. Roosevelt's response was a model of understated gravity. He did not rush, but neither did he ignore. He chose the middle path: observe, prepare, and build. And by the time the United States officially entered the war in December 1941, the atomic program was already evolving into something far beyond what Einstein or Szilard had imagined. The president's reaction, measured but firm, ensured that the warning would not be lost in bureaucracy or disbelief. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution in warfare, one that would reshape the 20th century. And though no bomb had yet been built and no city destroyed, the future was now inexorably in motion. As war erupted across Europe and eventually consumed the globe, Roosevelt's understated decision to act on Einstein's letter quietly gave birth to one of the most secretive and ambitious scientific undertakings in history. The Manhattan Project, what began as a cautious investigation into uranium research, was quickly transformed into a sprawling, government-backed effort to harness the power of the atom before Nazi Germany could. The early stages of the project were still fragmented, experimental, and uncertain. Scientists debated not only whether an atomic bomb could be built, but also how it should be built, what material would be most effective, how the reaction could be sustained, how the energy could be contained and then unleashed. There were more questions than answers, and each answer seemed to generate new branches of complexity. But under the stewardship of Vannevar Bush and later General Leslie Groves, the Manhattan Project evolved from theoretical chatter into coordinated action. One of the first major steps came in 1941, when Bush met with Roosevelt to request expanded funding and authority. Bush argued that the work being done was not merely important, it was urgent. The Germans were working along parallel lines. The science was promising, but to succeed, the United States would need unprecedented support: labs, factories, mines, security, secrecy. Roosevelt, convinced by Bush's calm persistence and the escalating situation in Europe, gave his blessing. What followed was the construction of an immense scientific and industrial machine. Entire towns were built in secret: Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington, Los Alamos in New Mexico. Thousands of workers, engineers, and physicists were recruited, many unaware of the full scope of the project. It was the largest collaborative scientific effort in U.S. history, fueled by urgency, patriotism, and a shared sense that time was running out. The scientific leadership of the Manhattan Project fell to J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant and enigmatic theoretical physicist. Oppenheimer was chosen not just for his intellect, but for his ability to unify and motivate diverse teams. At Los Alamos, he assembled a dream team of scientific mindsmen and women who had fled persecution, who had grown up in the shadows of war, and who now worked toward a common, terrible goal: the construction of a bomb. Einstein, however, was notably absent. Despite having signed the letter that catalyzed the project, he was excluded from participation. The FBI and military officials considered him a security risk. His past political affiliations and his outspoken pacifism made them wary. Ironically, the man whose name had prompted the bomb's development was never allowed to contribute to its design. This exclusion stung Einstein, though he accepted it without protest. He continued his work at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, distanced from the storm he had helped stir. He was kept mostly in the dark about the project's progress, informed only through occasional updates or leaks from colleagues. And yet, in private moments, he wondered what had been unleashed on, whether the path now being followed could ever be reversed. Back within the project, challenges mounted daily. The engineering hurdles were immense. Enriching uranium, creating plutonium, designing a detonation system that would work at the right moment and at the right yield. Entire branches of science had to be invented just to solve these puzzles. Theoretical physics collided with industrial production in ways that had never been seen before. And always in the background was the ticking clock. What if the Germans beat them to it? But as the war dragged on, intelligence reports suggested that Germany's atomic program was not as advanced as feared. Still, the Americans pressed forward. The logic was simple and terrifying. Even if Germany failed, the bomb might be needed to end the war with Japan. The weapon, once imagined as a desperate defense against Hitler, was quickly becoming a strategic asset in its own right. By 1944, the Manhattan Project had consumed billions of dollars and involved over 130,000 people. It operated under a veil of secrecy so thick that even Vice President Truman was unaware of its existence until Roosevelt's death. The work was conducted in remote labs, behind barbed wire fences, in windowless factories humming day and night. It was not just a project, it was a shadow civilization growing in silence. And yet it all traced back to one moment on a porch in Long Island. One letter, one signature, one reluctant warning that had opened the door to the atomic age. Now, with the bomb inching closer to reality, the world stood unknowingly at a crossroads. The Manhattan Project was no longer theoretical, it was real, massive, and nearly complete. And the question that now haunted the physicists and leaders alike was not whether the bomb could be built. It was what would happen when it finally was. As the Manhattan Project grew from a quiet scientific endeavor into a vast military-industrial complex, Albert Einstein, the man whose name had helped spark it, always conspicuously sidelined. Though his 1939 letter to Roosevelt had served as the catalyst for the United States' entry into atomic weapons development, Einstein himself was never invited to join the project, never granted a security clearance, and never consulted for his scientific insight. The very forces of secrecy and suspicion that drove the project forward also conspired to keep him out. This exclusion was not accidental. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had long viewed Einstein with suspicion, keeping an open file on the physicist filled with years of surveillance reports, intercepted correspondence, and wild speculations about his associations. Einstein's outspoken views, his support for civil rights, global disarmament, socialism, and his sharp criticism of fascism made him, in the eyes of U.S. intelligence agencies, a potential subversive. When the Manhattan Project took form under military leadership, particularly under General Leslie Groves, Einstein was swiftly deemed a security risk. Ironically, Einstein's exclusion reflected a growing divide between theoretical purity and militarized science. The Manhattan Project had no room for dissent, no tolerance for public intellectuals who might question its aims or speak too freely. It demanded secrecy, loyalty, and compliance. Einstein, brilliant though he was, embodied none of those qualities. His fame could not protect him from being considered dangerous by the very nation he had adopted as his home. Privately, Einstein was deeply hurt. He had not expected to build the bomb himself. Nuclear engineering was far from his specialty. but he had assumed he might be consulted, or at the very least kept informed. Instead, he was cut off. The letter he had signed had disappeared into the vaults of classified wartime bureaucracy, and its consequences spiraled beyond his control. Einstein's isolation during this period was more than just physical, was moral and philosophical. He watched as the scientific community, once devoted to understanding nature and elevating the human condition, became entangled in state secrecy and weapons manufacturing. He corresponded with friends and colleagues still involved in the project, occasionally catching glimpses of what was being done, but the details were fragmentary. The full scale of the Manhattan Project was hidden even from most of those within it. He was not alone in his unease. Some of the project's key scientists, Leo Szilard, Niels Bohr, James Franck, began to express concerns about the ethical implications of their work. Bohr, in particular, feared an arms race and believed the bomb should be placed under international control before its first use. Franck later chaired a report recommending against using the weapon on civilian populations, warning of a post-war world spiraling into perpetual fear and retaliation. These voices of caution, however, were drowned out by military urgency and political momentum. Einstein, meanwhile, returned to the work that had long sustained him: theoretical physics, cosmology, and a tireless campaign for peace. He began speaking more openly about his fears, though he could not discuss classified details. He made veiled references in public lectures to the dangers of unchecked scientific progress. He warned that the world stood at the edge of a precipice, and that, without global cooperation and transparency, the future would be defined not by progress but by terror. His tone grew more somber with each passing month. He had once believed that reason could guide civilization, that science could uplift the human spirit. Now he feared it had become a servant of destruction. The irony was bitter. The very equation that had helped reveal the energy locked within atoms E equals mc was now being used to unlock a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. Despite his exclusion, Einstein never denounced the scientists working on the bomb. He understood their fear of Nazi Germany, shared their sense of urgency, but he mourned the path they were now traveling. He feared that once the bomb was built, it would not end with the war, that it would continue to shape politics, diplomacy, and culture long after peace was declared. And so he watched, quietly, as the project he had helped to inspire unfolded without him. He waited. He hoped, perhaps, that the weapon would never be needed, that diplomacy would prevail. But deep down, he knew the world was heading toward a revelation and that his name would be forever linked to what came next. In those years of waiting, Einstein would sometimes revisit a question he had once posed. Is the universe a friendly place? Increasingly, he wasn't sure. But he knew one thing with certainty, that knowledge, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered. And the fate of the world now rested in how that knowledge would be used. By the early 1940s, the Manhattan Project had grown into a massive, sprawling enterprise so vast and compartmentalized that most of its participants knew only fragments of the full picture. Thousands of workers, scientists, engineers, and laborers toiled in secrecy across dozens of facilities in the United States and Canada, unaware that they were contributing to the construction of a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever wielded. The project's success depended not only on scientific genius, but on an unprecedented level of security, coordination, and industrial effort. The locations were chosen for their isolation, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became the heart of uranium enrichment. Its enormous gaseous diffusion plant stretched for miles and hummed day and night with machines designed to separate the rare uranium-235 isotope from its more common counterpart. At Hanford, Washington, newly built reactors bred plutonium in top-secret facilities nestled near the Columbia River, and in Los Alamos, New Mexico, a rugged mesa far removed from major cities, some of the world's most brilliant physicists gathered to solve the final terrifying riddle: how to design, detonate, and deliver the bomb. The project was overseen by General Leslie Groves, a man of enormous organizational skill and little patience for sentiment. Groves had previously built the Pentagon and was now tasked with constructing a different kind of fortress, one made not of steel and concrete, but of equations and silence. He enforced strict compartmentalization. Scientists were forbidden to discuss their work with others outside their designated teams. Workers were often unaware of the materials they handled or the purpose behind their tasks. Even families were kept in the dark. This culture of secrecy was, in part, a response to legitimate fears. There was constant anxiety that Nazi Germany might also be racing to develop an atomic bomb. Allied intelligence, though limited and often speculative, reported that German physicists were experimenting with uranium. Though the extent of their progress was unclear, the threat loomed large. The Manhattan Project was, at its core, a race one, not against the clock, but against an enemy presumed to be building in parallel. Inside Los Alamos, J. Robert Oppenheimer presided over a strange blend of military discipline and academic freedom. He recruited a dazzling array of physicists, chemists, and mathematicians, many of them European emigrants like Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, and Niels Bohr. These were men who had fled tyranny, who now found themselves building the ultimate weapon to defeat it. The work was intense, secretive, and often morally fraught. Scientists labored for months in isolation, developing theories by day and arguing ethics by night. Oppenheimer himself was a deeply conflicted. He understood that the bomb was not just a weapon, it was a threshold. Crossing it would forever change how humanity conceived of power, war, and responsibility. Yet, amid all the theory and design, the practical hurdles were enormous. Scientists had to devise two completely different bomb designs: a uranium-based device known as Little Boy and a plutonium-based implosion device, Fat Man. The uranium bomb was conceptually simpler, but required vast amounts of enriched material. The plutonium bomb, on the other hand, presented an entirely new challenge: how to compress a volatile core in a perfectly symmetrical implosion using carefully timed explosives. Mistakes could not be tolerated. A miscalculation could result in a dud door, a premature detonation. As the weapon took shape, so too did the understanding that its use would not merely end a war, but potentially define a new epoch of human history. And yet, despite the looming gravity of their mission, most of the project's personnel remained singularly focused on the task. The war offered clarity, even if the consequences did not. Throughout it all, Albert Einstein remained on the outside. He was not consulted, not briefed, not invited to contribute, but he was not unaware. Friends and colleagues kept him informed in vague, cautious terms. He knew enough to understand that the bomb was close. And though he had long feared that Hitler might develop it first, it was becoming clear that Germany's atomic program had faltered. The Allies, not the Nazis, would be the first to split the atom in anger. This realization changed everything. The original justification that the bomb was a desperate defense against tyranny began to weaken. With Germany's defeat now inevitable, attention turned to Japan, and suddenly the bomb was no longer a last resort. It was an option, a strategy, perhaps even a tool for diplomacy. Secrecy continued to blanket the project. Congress was kept in the dark. The American public had no idea what was happening in the hills of New Mexico or the valleys of Tennessee. Even many in the military were unaware. It was a weapon born in shadow, constructed in silence, and when it emerged, it would not be announced, it would be demonstrated. In those final months before its unveiling, the Manhattan Project had become something beyond science. It was mythic, apocalyptic, and in many ways inevitable. The weapon was nearly ready. The test was coming, and the world would never again be the same. As the Manhattan Project surged forward in secrecy and scope, Albert Einstein found himself relegated to the periphery, a bystander to a history he had helped set in motion. While others were forging the machinery of the bomb in desert laboratories and government bunkers, Einstein remained in Princeton, largely uninformed about the specifics, but increasingly burdened by the weight of what he knew or suspected was coming. And as reports of the project's progress filtered through back channels and cautious letters from colleagues, a profound unease settled into him. Einstein's initial support for warning Roosevelt had been grounded in a very specific fear that Hitler's Germany would develop the atomic bomb first. He had acted reluctantly but firmly, convinced that such a weapon in Nazi hands would be catastrophic. But by 1944, that fear had dissipated. Intelligence revealed that the German atomic program was disorganized and underfunded. Werner Heisenberg and his team had made progress, but nowhere near the level feared. The race that had sparked the urgency, the reason for Einstein's infamous letter, was already lost by Germany. This realization shook Einstein. If Germany was no longer a threat, then the rationale for building the bomb shifted dramatically. No longer a desperate countermeasure, the bomb was now a strategic weapon, a tool the United States could wield unopposed. Einstein had not signed up for that. He had signed the letter as a pacifist, compromised by necessity, not as an advocate for atomic supremacy. His private letters from this period reflect a growing sorrow. He wrote to friends that he deeply regretted his role in initiating the arms race. To Linus Pauling, he admitted, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made." It was a rare admission from a man known for his confidence and conviction. But in this case, his conscience was louder than his certainty. Einstein's sense of betrayal was compounded by his total exclusion from the Manhattan Project. Though he had expected to remain at arm's length due to his non-military stance, the depth of his sidelining was still painful. He had imagined offering insight or moral guidance, perhaps helping to steer the use of the bomb toward deterrence or diplomacy. But instead, he was shut out entirely. His warnings now submerged beneath layers of classification and command. He watched as the scientific community, his community, was transformed. Laboratories that once pursued truth and understanding now pursued weapon yields and critical mass. Former pacifists had become project managers. Equations that once described the beauty of the cosmos were now calculated to flatten cities. The culture of science had changed, and Einstein feared it might never recover. By early 1945, it was clear that the bomb would be ready before the war ended. Einstein, increasingly isolated from the decision-making process, began speaking out again cautiously, given wartime constraints, but with growing urgency. He advocated for international oversight of atomic research and warned of a new global arms race. He hoped the bomb, if used, would be treated not as a triumph but as a warning reason to build peace, not more bombs. But he was also realistic. Einstein understood power. He had seen how governments worked, how fear and ambition often drowned out wisdom. He worried that once the bomb was demonstrated, its utility would outweigh its horror. That instead of being the weapon to end all wars, it would become the cornerstone of a new era of militarized science and permanent tension. Einstein did not call for halting the bomb's completion. He knew it was too late, but he began to shift his efforts toward shaping what might come after. He joined other scientists in advocating for post-war arms control, global cooperation, and the formation of international scientific bodies to oversee atomic research. He hoped that reason might still prevail, even if it had come too late to stop the first detonation. Yet, in his heart, he remained haunted. He had wanted peace. He had acted out of fear. And now, the most powerful weapon in human history was about to be unleashed, not on a battlefield, but on a city. In quiet moments, he would walk the garden paths of Princeton or stare out from his study window, lost in thought. He had unlocked the secrets of the universe, but he could not control how humanity would use them. The chain reaction he had helped begin was no longer atomic, it was historical, irreversible. The regret did not break him, but it never left him. It lingered like fallout silent. On August 6, 1945, the world entered a new and irreversible era. That morning, just after 8:15 a.m., the American B-29 bomber, Enola Gay, released a single bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It fell for 44 seconds before detonating with a blinding flash, unleashing a fireball that vaporized buildings, melted steel, and turned tens of thousands of people to ash in an instant. The weapon, nicknamed Little Boy, was powered by uranium-235, the same material Einstein and Szilard had warned about 6 years earlier in a quiet letter to President Roosevelt. The bomb's yield was roughly 15 kilotons of TNT, but its impact went far beyond physical destruction. It created a new vocabulary of horror: thermal radiation, blast waves, nuclear shadows. In Hiroshima, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly, with tens of thousands more succumbing to injuries, radiation sickness, and long-term health effects in the days, months, and years that followed. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, this one using plutonium, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The Fat Man bomb was more sophisticated and even more powerful, killing another 40,000 people in its initial blast. The terrain of Nagasaki, with its hills and valleys, somewhat shielded parts of the city, but the devastation was still unimaginable. With these two bombings, the world witnessed the full realization of atomic theory as weapon. The theoretical equations scribbled on blackboards, the quietly drafted letter from Einstein, the years of classified research culminated in a light brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a silence heavier than death itself. Albert Einstein was not informed beforehand. He learned about the bombing the same way the general public did, through the newspapers. The headlines were triumphant. Atomic bomb hits Japan. Japs warned of reign of ruin. The tone was one of victory, of technological achievement. But Einstein did not share the celebration. When a friend asked him what he thought, he simply replied, "Woe is me." Later, he would clarify, The war was won, but the peace was lost. Einstein had envisioned the bomb as a desperate safeguard against Nazi tyranny, that it had been used against a defeated, cornered Japan already weakened by conventional bombing and blockades deepened his despair. He questioned not only the necessity of the bombings, but the precedent they set. Now, the world knew what such a weapon could do. Now, any future war would be haunted by the possibility of instant annihilation. Publicly, Einstein did not attack the scientists who had built the bomb. He understood the logic of wartime decision-making, the momentum that had built up around the project. But privately, he mourned. The United States, he feared, had crossed a threshold with no clear way back. By using the bomb not as a deterrent, but as a weapon of first strike, it had demonstrated that atomic power was not just a possibility, was a policy. Within days of the bombings, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. But in the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a new kind of war had begun, not with battles, but with balance. The Cold War would be built on the quiet threat of mutual destruction. The atomic bomb was no longer a theory or a secret teat, was the foundation of modern geopolitics. Einstein's reaction was immediate. He intensified his advocacy for arms control, for international oversight, for a global organization that could prevent nuclear catastrophe. He co-founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists with Leo Szilard, writing letters, giving interviews, trying to shift the narrative from triumph to reflection. The bomb had ended a war, yes, but what kind of world had it begun? He understood that the genie could not be put back in the bottle. The knowledge of the bomb was out, and more nations would inevitably seek it. But he hoped desperately, urgently, that humanity might rise to the moment, that we might learn from the devastation rather than repeat it. To Einstein, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not symbols of victory. They were warnings. They were the price of knowledge unmoored from ethics. They were what happened when science served fear instead of wisdom. And though he had not built the bomb, nor dropped it, Einstein knew that his name would always be linked to those twin flashes in the Japanese sky. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man who opened a door he could not close. Though the 1939 letter to Roosevelt was the most famous Einstein ever wrote, it was far from the last. In the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein picked up his pen again, not to warn of what might come, but to respond to what had already happened. He became a prolific letter writer in his final decade, channeling his regret, hope, and urgent moral vision into correspondence that spanned continents, ideologies, and generations. One of his first major post-war actions was the founding of the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists in 1946, alongside his longtime friend and collaborator, Leo Szilard. The committee's mission was clear: to educate the public about the dangers of nuclear weapons and to promote international control of atomic energy. Einstein served as chairman, and his stature drew attention. He wrote countless letters to scientists, political leaders, journalists, and ordinary citizens, donations, dialogue, and disarmament. His writing style during this period was a blend of weary realism and stubborn idealism. In public letters and speeches, he warned that the world stood at a crossroads. Either it would come together to manage atomic power wisely, or it would dissolve into perpetual threat and eventual annihilation. He championed the newly formed United Nations, but insisted it would need to evolve beyond a loose federation of states. It must become a true global authority, capable of regulating weapons, resolving disputes, and preventing wars. To fellow scientists, he sent private appeals. He urged them not to retreat into laboratories, but to engage with the world they had helped change. He believed that scientists had a special responsibility, not only to discover truth, but to safeguard it. "The unleashed power of the atom," he wrote, "has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." Some of Einstein's most poignant letters during this time were personal and introspective. He wrote to children who had questions about war and peace, to Holocaust survivors who saw him as a symbol of dignity, and to former colleagues now wrestling with their roles in the Manhattan Project. He remained gracious, often gentle, but never complacent. He encouraged honesty, forgiveness, and reflection. "We cannot change the past," he told one young student, "but we can learn from it. That is how the future is built." He also began corresponding with Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher who shared his pacifist inclinations and concern over nuclear weapons. Their exchanges would eventually culminate in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, published in 1955, a bold call to scientists around the world to recognize their moral responsibilities. In it, they warned that global conflict in the nuclear age could mean the end of civilization, perhaps even of humanity itself. The manifesto's concluding question was stark and unforgettable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? Einstein's letters were not limited to nuclear issues. He also weighed in on civil rights, education, philosophy, and Zionism. But the atomic bomb remained the central moral issue of his final years. He saw in it both the brilliance and the blindness of modern science, how easily knowledge could outpace wisdom. Throughout these letters, one finds no bitterness, but a deep, enduring sorrow. He never tried to deflect responsibility. He did not pretend that his warning to Roosevelt had been meaningless. Rather, he accepted the complexity of his role and dedicated his remaining years to guiding humanity toward what he hoped would be a better path. It is telling that Einstein's final years were not spent in celebration of his achievements, but in warning of their consequences. The same man who had revolutionized physics now tried, with quiet urgency, to revolutionize conscience. He could not undo the past, but he could help illuminate the road ahead. His letters became lanterns scattered lights in a darkening world, each one a gentle but insistent voice saying, "Think, reflect, take care." The atom had been split. Now it was the mind and the heart that needed mending. Albert Einstein's name would forever be associated with genius, with relativity, with the bending of light and time. But for millions, his name had also become a symbol of something darker, the atomic bomb. This association was both inaccurate and inescapably cruel irony for a man who had so openly loathed violence, who had warned of the dangers of power untethered from ethics, and who had been systematically excluded from the very project his signature helped to launch. Einstein never built the bomb. He never worked on it. He was not consulted about its design, nor was he aware of its progress beyond fragments gleaned from friends and newspapers. Yet, the equation at the heart of the bomb's conceptual foundation, E equals mc, was his, and more importantly, it was his famous letter that had first opened the door. The irony was profound, and it weighed on him until the end of his life. For many Americans in the post-war years, Einstein had become a paradox. He was revered as a scientific genius, but distrusted for his pacifism, his left-leaning politics, and his refusal to align with Cold War binaries. He had warned of Hitler, but now warned of American militarism. He had asked Roosevelt to act, but pleaded with Truman not to use the bomb again. His name was etched into the popular imagination as both a prophet and a dissenter. The cultural portrayal of Einstein after the war further complicated his legacy. He became the face of atomic science, photographed with chalk in hand, his wild hair a halo of intellect. Cartoonists and journalists invoked him whenever a headline mentioned the bomb. Schoolchildren studied his theory of relativity in the same breath as they studied Hiroshima. Public fascination clung to his eccentricities, his pipe, his socks, his bicycle, but rarely to the clarity of his conscience. Einstein, for his part, accepted the contradictions. He spoke frankly about his mistakes and his hopes. "I do not consider myself the father of the release of atomic energy," he once said. "My part in it was quite indirect." Yet he did not deny his influence. He simply believed that influence came with responsibility, and that responsibility had been insufficiently shared. He also knew that the bomb had not only changed warfare, it had changed science itself. No longer could researchers pursue knowledge in isolation from consequence. The boundaries between laboratory and battlefield had dissolved. Physicists were now political actors, whether they wished to be or not. Funding, fame, and government agendas intertwined with discovery. Einstein feared this trend deeply. In his later years, he advocated tirelessly for the democratization of science. He called for transparency, international collaboration, and disarmament. He wrote against secrecy and censorship, against the stockpiling of weapons, against the use of science for domination rather than liberation. These positions, though moral, made him unpopular with some former colleagues and many in government. Yet, despite criticism, Einstein never wavered. He believed in the power of ideas, in the long arc of reason. He continued to teach, to write, and to meet with students who saw him not just as a physicist, but as a compass. He urged them to think independently, to question authority, to consider not just what science could do, but what it should do. The irony of Einstein's legacy was that his most famous contribution to peace, the letter to Roosevelt, had helped build the world's most dangerous weapon. But it was also true that without his warning, the course of the war and the future that followed might have been even darker. The same act that haunted him had, in many ways, awakened the world to the responsibility of science. Einstein's life thus became a mirror for the 20th century. Brilliant, tragic, complex, he had illuminated the workings of the cosmos and cast a light on the shadows of our own nature. He had split the atom of knowledge and found, at its core, both the sublime and the terrifying. And in this irony, in this fusion of enlightenment and danger, lay the truth of modern humanity. We could touch the stars, but also destroy ourselves. Einstein saw both possibilities clearly, and for the rest of his life, he tried to guide us toward the stars. The development and use of the atomic bomb thrust many scientists into uncharted moral territory. Men like J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and Leo Szilard, once devoted solely to discovery, now found themselves bearing a heavy burden. The consequences of knowledge weaponized. Oppenheimer, often called the father of the atomic bomb, wrestled deeply with the duality of his creation. He had led the Los Alamos laboratory with brilliant efficiency. But after witnessing the first successful Testa Trinity explosion in July 1945, he was famously haunted by the moment. Quoting the Bhagavad Gita, he said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His remorse would shape his later years, where he became an advocate for international control of nuclear weapons, and was eventually sidelined during the Red Scare for his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. Leo Szilard, who had initially urged Einstein to warn Roosevelt, later became one of the most vocal critics of the bomb's use. He helped draft the Frank Report, which recommended demonstrating the bomb's power to Japan before using it on civilians, hoping to avoid mass casualties and open the door for peace negotiations. Szilard feared that nuclear weapons would ignite an arms race and destabilize international relations, a fear that proved prescient during the Cold War. Enrico Fermi, whose experiments with nuclear reactors paved the way for controlled fission, was more pragmatic. While he understood the bomb's terrible power, he viewed it as a necessary evil to end the war. Afterward, Fermi contributed to nuclear energy research, believing atomic power could be harnessed for peaceful purposes, though he never lost sight of the weapon's potential for destruction. These scientists, and many others, struggled to reconcile their roles as creators of unparalleled destruction with their identities as seekers of knowledge. Many felt a profound sense of guilt and responsibility. Some turned to activism, lobbying for arms control treaties and international cooperation. Others retreated into their fields, hoping the horrors they unleashed would remain a one-time event. Their burden was not just scientific or political, was deeply personal. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had killed hundreds of thousands, many of them civilians. The ethical questions were agonizing. Could the bombings be justified? Was there an alternative? What was the responsibility of the scientist in war? In the years following the war, the atomic scientists became advocates for peace. Yet they remained haunted by the knowledge that their work had changed the world forever. The hope was that humanity would learn from this dark chapter and strive for a future where science served life, not death. Einstein understood this burden well. Though excluded from the project, he empathized with these men's moral struggles. He recognized that science was not value neutral, and that the choices of scientists could reverberate through history. His final years were devoted to urging the scientific community to embrace that responsibility, to become guardians, not just discoverers. The legacy of these scientists is thus a complicated one. Pioneers of human knowledge, architects of a terrifying new power, and ultimately, voices of conscience in a world forever altered by their discoveries. The brief letter Einstein signed in 1939 cast a shadow that stretched far beyond its humble beginnings. What started as a warning about Nazi Germany's potential to build an atomic bomb evolved into a catalyst for the nuclear age, an era defined by unprecedented power, peril, and political complexity. After World War II, the world quickly divided into rival blocs, locked in a tense standoff known as the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to build ever more powerful nuclear arsenals, each convinced that deterrence through mutual destruction was the only way to prevent global annihilation. The letter that once cautioned about one dangerous regime now underpinned decades of international tension and fear. Einstein's letter and the Manhattan Project, it helped inspire shaped not just military strategy, but global diplomacy. Nuclear weapons became a central issue in treaties, summits, and secret negotiations. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and countless arms control talks all echoed with the legacy of that small note penned in 1939. At the same time, the letter's legacy rippled into science and culture. It altered the relationship between scientists and governments, ushering in an era where science was inseparable from politics and national security. Laboratories became centers of military innovation, and funding followed strategic priorities. The dream of pure, detached inquiry gave way to a world where knowledge was often a matter of survival. Culturally, the atomic bomb and its origins permeated art, literature, film, and public consciousness. It symbolized both human achievement and hubris, a paradox of enlightenment and destruction. The bomb became a metaphor for the modern condition, our capacity to create and destroy, to illuminate and obliterate. Einstein himself lived to see much of this unfold. He became an outspoken advocate for peace, nuclear disarmament, and global governance to prevent the horrors he had once warned about. He recognized that the letter, while a necessary call to action, had also opened Pandora's box. The lessons of the letter remain urgent today. The risks of nuclear proliferation, the challenges of scientific ethics, and the need for international cooperation are more pressing than ever. The 200 words Einstein signed did not just change the course of a war, they altered the destiny of humanity. In reflecting on this, we see how a single an urgent warning penned at a critical moment can ripple through history, shaping decades of conflict, diplomacy, science, and culture. The letter's shadow is a reminder of both the power and responsibility embedded in knowledge. As we live in a world still shaped by that atomic age, Einstein's letter remains a profound symbol, a cautionary tale, and a call to conscience, urging us to choose wisely the paths we follow. In the last decade of his life, Albert Einstein's thoughts and efforts were consumed by a desperate hope for peace and reason amid a rapidly changing world. Though no longer at the center of groundbreaking scientific discovery, he remained a towering moral and intellectual presence, tirelessly advocating for nuclear disarmament, international cooperation, and human rights. Einstein spent much of his time writing letters and essays urging world leaders to come together to control atomic weapons. He saw the post-war era as a moment of perilous opportunity. Humanity could either spiral into permanent fear and rivalry or forge a new path toward global unity. To that end, he supported the establishment of the United Nations and consistently called for the creation of a world government empowered to regulate nuclear arms. Yet, Einstein's vision was never naive. He understood the deep-rooted divisions between nations and ideologies, the mistrust born of war, and the human tendencies toward fear and domination. His pleas often met with resistance or indifference from politicians and publics alike. The Cold War's shadow grew longer, and the specter of nuclear annihilation became a constant presence in global affairs. Scientifically, Einstein continued to pursue his lifelong quest for a unified field theory that would reconcile the forces of nature and provide a deeper understanding of the universe. Though unsuccessful, this work demonstrated his undiminished curiosity and dedication to fundamental truth. Einstein's health began to decline in the early 1950s. He suffered from heart and abdominal issues, but remained intellectually active until the end. Even as the world around him became increasingly tense and divided, he continued to speak out against war, racism, and injustice. In April 1955, Einstein passed away quietly at the age of 76. His final words were spoken in German to his nurse, a private reflection lost to history. But his legacy, both scientific and ethically, goes far beyond his death. Einstein's final years embodied the contradictions and hopes of the century he helped shape. A man who unlocked the secrets of the cosmos, yet mourned the misuse of his discoveries. A pacifist who reluctantly supported war to stop tyranny. A visionary who believed deeply in the power of reason, yet witnessed the descent into fear and conflict. His life was a testament to the complexity of human progress, the way knowledge can illuminate and endanger, uplift and divide. Einstein's story reminds us that science is not isolated from the world, but profoundly woven into its moral fabric. And in the twilight of his life, he urged humanity to rise above its divisions, to harness knowledge not for destruction, but for the common good. His final years were not about triumph, but about warning, reflection, and hope, a hope that the future might yet be brighter than the past. Looking back, it is astonishing how a letter of fewer than 200 words could change the course of history so profoundly. Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt was concise, barely a page long, but within its lines lay the weight of a world on the brink. It was a spark that ignited the nuclear age, a call to action that set in motion forces far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The letter was simple in form, but monumental in consequence. It warned of new scientific discoveries, with the potential to build weapons of unprecedented power. It urged vigilance, preparation, and swift action. It was born from fear that the Nazis might wield such power firsthand, a reluctant hope that the United States could prevent catastrophe. From that moment, everything changed. The quiet labs and university offices, where atomic theory was once a matter of curiosity, became the birthplace of immense destruction. Cities learned forever. The Cold War was born. The terrifying promise of mutually assured destruction loomed large for decades. Yet the letter also embodies a deeper truth about human knowledge, how small actions can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. A few words written by a man famous for his genius, urged on by a group of worried scientists, became the hinge upon which the 20th century turned. It was a moment when science, politics, morality, and history collided. Einstein's letter reminds us that knowledge carries responsibility. It is never neutral or abstract. It shapes societies, defines destinies, and challenges us to consider not only what we can do, but what we should do. The atom had been split. Now humanity had to decide how to live with that power. The legacy of those 200 words is still with us. The shadow of the bomb remains, as do the questions it raises about war, peace, and the future of civilization. Einstein's letter was both a warning and a beginning, a testament to the power of ideas, and a call to conscience that echoes through history. In the quiet of reflection, we return to that brief note and see it anew, a tiny seed planted on the shores of history, from which grew a vast and complex world, a world forever changed by the letter. Albert Einstein signed a letter that in fewer than 200 words changed the world.